Chapter 29 lecture for Music History 2, MUSC 324. So we started this lecture in class right before spring break, but due to us shifting to the online format, I'm obviously not going to be able to finish Chapter 29. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. I'm just going to kind of very quickly go through the first part of it that we've already covered, and then get into a little more depth in it for the last part of it. So, as we talked about in class, there was this new development during the Romantic era where people began to look at and perform music from the past. Various composers did this. Liszt did this by studying and performing music of earlier composers. Mendelssohn did this by discovering and resurrecting the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Composers such as Mendelssohn and Brahms, who we'll talk about in a moment, looked back to the Renaissance and the Baroque and classical eras for inspiration in their forms and things like that. So that's where this idea of classical music being a museum society came from. These developments where people started to program and perform older music as well as new music. And in the 20th century, a lot of that shifted to performing almost entirely older music, with not a lot of new music being performed, proportionally speaking. As we talked about also in class, classical music was popular music, and people would behave at classical concerts kind of like they do at popular concerts. Today, they would clap whenever something moved them to clap. They weren't instructed to sit very still and be quiet. They would talk, they would move around. If they heard something that they liked, they would, if there was a 4-movement symphony and the audience really loved the second movement, they would clap and stomp and demand an encore until the orchestra repeated the second movement before the audience would let them go on to the third movement of the symphony. As we go through the later Romantic era, composers began to treat their music more as art than as popular music, and audience behavior shifted. So you were supposed to be more reverential, not interrupt the music so much because it was art. If you've ever gone into a museum, people don't run around museums screaming and yelling, except maybe tour groups of very small children. But most people are actually pretty quiet when they go into a museum. They don't want to disturb the people around them from focusing on the art. That's kind of where it came from in classical music. We talked about Brahms versus Wagner. We talked about Wagner and how he was this pioneering spirit who developed a lot of new forms of music and pushed music harmonically to its limits in many ways. Brahms was more of a traditionalist. Brahms had studied earlier music, and his music tended to be more tonal. Now, he was inventive in certain ways. He actually rhythmically did some interesting things, rhythmically especially, but basically he viewed himself as an extension of what had come before him, whereas Wagner was trying to blow it all up. And this is where this musical divide happened. The proponents of Wagner, who wanted everything to be just blown up and started fresh, and proponents of Brahms, who revered the past to some degree, and they wanted new music and new developments, but they wanted them to be built on the past. So this dispute kind of, people adopted Brahms and adopted Wagner as the leaders of this dispute, but it was really just a big argument between two groups of music lovers, if you think about it that way. I think this is about where we left off on our last lecture. Brahms wrote just an absolute ton of music. The list is here on the PowerPoint. I don't have to read you this list. But all of his genres, he didn't really invent anything new. These are all extensions of things that had happened earlier. With the possible exception of his German Requiem, he wrote a Requiem Mass, which had always been in Latin, using Latin texts. Brahms actually used German text from the Bible instead of the traditional Latin movements of the Requiem that famous composers from Mozart to Verdi and even earlier, much earlier, had written. So that's a little different, his German Requiem, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of choral music ever written, and I highly commend it to you. Talked about Brahms' relationship with the Schumanns, and specifically Clara Schumann, that Robert and Clara Schumann when Brahms was a young, struggling composer, really helped him establish himself and get published and performed and become famous. And then when Robert died, Johannes helped Clara take care of their children, and they stayed together. Purely platonic. There was not a romantic relationship, although most historians are pretty convinced that at least Brahms was in love with Clara, but they never did anything about it. And then she died. She was about 14 years older than him, and she died, and he died shortly after that. This is, I think this is about where we left off. Brahms's symphonies, he's considered to be probably the second greatest symphonist who's ever lived behind Beethoven. Beethoven wrote his 9. Brahms spent 20 years composing his first symphony because he knew it would be judged against Beethoven's symphonies. It was a huge success, and so after that, he composed his 2nd, 3rd, and 4th symphonies fairly quickly. And that's where we left off. So, I'm going to put a YouTube video up, link to it online, of the finale from Brahms' 4th Symphony, because it's really cool. It's a great example of a lot of things that Brahms did. First of all, I mean, it's the 4th movement of a standard 4-movement symphony, which is Brahms wrote. He didn't reinvent the form of symphony, but it uses an older structure, specifically a chaconne, which is a Baroque form. It's similar in some ways. If you think back in the fall semester, we talked about the ground bass, which was a bass line that repeated over and over and over and was typically in triple meter, then that had additional music on top of it. A chaconne is sort of like that. This is in triple meter, and it has a repeating bass line, although the way Brahms writes it, it's not always in the bass and it's not always identical, although it always uses the same structure, same melodic structure. It's a really cool piece of music. It's just a series of variations. You have your opening chaconne theme, which is stated by the whole orchestra, and then 31 variations. Don't worry, they're all very short variations. It's a really neat form of music, and it really shows off Brahms's mastery of not only contemporary romantic writing, but also his mastery of older forms, the Baroque form, the chaconne. Something else to point out here is when you're following along with this, is the thing called a hemiola, which is essentially when you have 3 beats and 2 beats happening at the same time. It's a polyrhythm. And this is something that Brahms is actually very well known for, utilizing polyrhythms in quite a few of his works. And especially in this movement, you'll find polyrhythms in multiple places. So in addition to his symphonies, his concertos, his piano concerto, 1 and 2, his violin concerto, both at absolutely the top of the repertoire. His concert overtures, that is to say, they are short works that were written to be performed in concert. They were not attached to an opera. Brahms did not write an opera. So his overtures were just intended to be performed as part of an orchestra concert, not as part of an opera. His tragic overture and his academic festival overture, I think I said this in class, in my opinion, Brahms' academic festival overture is as close to a perfect piece of music as has ever been written in classical music. That doesn't mean I think it's the best piece of music ever written, although I think it's way up there. I just think everything Brahms was trying to achieve with his academic festival overture, he did. It's structurally and musically just incredibly intense. Brahms also wrote a bunch of piano music. Didn't sound like anyone else. Of course, that was always the goal of a romantic composer, is to have their music not sound like anyone else's music. But he wrote 3 full piano sonatas, he wrote sets of variations, he wrote intermezzos, rhapsodies, many short pieces. So, if you're a piano player, absolutely explore the music of Brahms. You don't have to tackle a full sonata. You can look at some of his shorter works. They're absolute miniature masterpieces. We've talked about the German Lied. The early masters of the German Lied, first Beethoven, and then, of course, Schubert, Schumann. Well, Brahms was the late German master of the art song. He wrote 260 Lied, many of them in strophic form, some of them in modified strophic form. And it's really quite fascinating if you listen to Brahms' music, because Brahms, as much as today we think of all classical musicians as being very highfalutin, wearing tuxedos and being very fancy people, Brahms wasn't really. He grew up in a very modest background, and he especially in his Lieder. His music, for as much as he looked back, it doesn't have the polished perfection of, say, Mozart's music, which is so polished you can see your reflection in it. Brahms's music is just, it's a little more like Haydn. It has more folk influences, and it's a little more accessible. Brahms is a composer who actually was very well loved by the performers, and by the public, and by the critics. So, and Brahms had the trifecta. He was loved by everyone who was really important. He also wrote a ton of choral music. He intended most of his choral works to be singable by amateur performers. His most famous choral work I mentioned about already is a German requiem, Ein Deutsches Requiem. You can read about it here in the PowerPoint. I don't need to read the PowerPoint to you. This is performed all over the world. It's an incredible piece of music. I was very fortunate when I was freelancing in Washington, D.C. I had a chance to perform it with members of the Kennedy Center Orchestra at the church where Bill Clinton was a member of the congregation. This would have been in the, obviously, in the mid-90s when Bill Clinton was still in office. And it was a great experience. It's an incredible piece of music, and it was really cool to play in that particular church. So, as I said about Brahms, in his time he was thought to be a little more conservative because of the way he looked back to the past for inspiration and how he didn't try to invent new forms, but instead just built on the forms that already existed. But when you actually look at his musical output, he was very progressive in many ways, not just rhythmically, but also in the way he utilized harmonies and utilized the orchestra as well. So this leads us to the New German School, which is the other half of the musical equation. We've already talked about Wagner. Now what's hilarious about the New German School to me is that this is a term that was thought up by a music critic, specifically for three composers. Wagner, who we've already talked about, who was German, Franz Liszt, who was Hungarian, and Hector Berlioz, who was French. So how could the New German School be made up of a German guy, a Hungarian guy, and a French guy? Well, I guess you could say it's because they viewed Beethoven as their model. Now, I think I mentioned this in class, but it bears repeating. Everybody viewed Beethoven as their model. It's just the question was, what were you trying to emulate? Some people, like Brahms, looked at Beethoven and they wanted to build on what Beethoven had done. Other people, like Berlioz, Liszt, and Wagner, looked at the fact that Beethoven had broken all the rules and had basically single-handedly ushered in a new era of music. And so they said, that's what I want to do. They looked at Beethoven as an inspiration to lead them to break all the rules and invent new things. So the New German School, while they weren't all German, they were all influenced by the greatest German composer who ever lived, Beethoven. However, this article by this music critic helped to set the idea of Wagner and the New German School on one side and Brahms and other more traditional, more conservative composers on the other side. Another list, there's a huge number of important European composers from the last part of the Romantic era. They're probably more important, I won't say probably, they're more important composers to come out of the Romantic era, historically speaking, than any other era. So, on the other side of the debate, in the New German School, not only you have Wagner, Liszt, and Hector Berlioz, but you also have Anton Bruckner, who was Austrian, who wrote massive symphonies, but also incredibly beautiful choral music. Chamber choirs actually singing one of Bruckner's Latin motets. Hugo Wolf. Hugo Wolf is one of my favorite characters in music because he was bipolar, and so he would literally do nothing for weeks or months on end, and then he would start composing, and he would write for days without sleeping, without even eating. And he would just write song after song. He wrote mostly art songs, is what Hugo Wolf is best remembered for. I just find his history to be so fascinating, and it kind of leads us back to our conversation we had about Robert Schumann, about great artists who have some kind of either antisocial or severe emotional issues that maybe that's the reason why they were great artists. Who knows? Richard Strauss, who is a great composer of opera, also a great composer of symphonic poems or tone poems, and Gustav Mahler, who wrote symphonies and art songs. Mahler was also Austrian. Strauss was German. Strauss and Mahler basically helped usher in the 20th century. They were bridge composers who moved us from the Romantic into the 20th century in many ways. So Liszt, we've already talked about Liszt, first as a piano composer and performer, now as a symphonic composer. We talked about the symphonic poem, which he preferred the term tone poem for that, but it was basically a one-movement, programmatic, orchestral work, usually somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes in length, although some of his were longer than that, some tone poems were shorter than that. But Liszt invented this genre. He came up with the idea. No one had ever really written a one-movement symphonic work like this before. So he invented it. He wrote 13 of them. He also wrote 2 symphonies, his Faust Symphony, based on Goethe's Faust. We've talked about, going all the way back to the beginning of the Romantic, how influential of a story Goethe's Faust was. Also a symphony based on Dante's Inferno. So you can see Liszt's influences. So the invention of the symphonic poem led many composers to begin to write symphonic poems. Of course, I already mentioned Strauss. Many composers, not just in the second half of the Romantic, but in the 20th century. As a matter of fact, in some ways, the symphonic poem is one of the most popular forms of music there is. If you've ever played in a concert band, and you've ever played any kind of piece, it doesn't even matter if it's a grade 1 or grade 2 piece that you played in middle school, that was kind of just a one-movement band piece that had a very descriptive title, and the music was trying to sound like, oh, I don't know, a train, or a car chase, or a storm, or something like that. I conducted a piece for a junior high honors band once called The Maelstrom by Robert W. Smith. Those are symphonic poems. They're shorter, they're for band, not orchestra, but they are symphonic poems. So Liszt pushed music harmonically, chromatically, specifically, really influenced Wagner in that way, and then eventually, of course, when we get to Strauss, that really pushed it. He was not afraid of the tritone. He divided the octaves directly in half. He invented a concept called thematic transformation, where you would write a theme, and then throughout the piece, that theme could come back in different guises, just like the Idee fixe in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, just like Wagner's use of leitmotifs. You remember that video we watched about leitmotifs, where the music would be the same, but they might change something about it, the speed, the register, even moving from major to minor to change the mood of it. Or even Brahms' use of developing variations, like the last movement of his 4th Symphony, where the theme is the same, but it varies in ways that completely change the character of it. That all comes out of Liszt's use of a concept he called thematic transformation. Anton Bruckner. Bruckner was an organist and wrote, as I said, a lot of vocal music, but he's best remembered for his symphonies and his vocal music, but he viewed the orchestra as an organ. His symphonies are massive. Some of his symphonies last well over an hour long, and the orchestra is treated as big blocks of sound, like an organist would play an organ. He was very religious, Catholic, because he was Austrian, and while Germany, after the Protestant Reformation, had become primarily Lutheran, Austria always remained Catholic. If you think back to Mozart, Mozart was Austrian, and he wrote Catholic masses, among other things. He liked the scope of Wagner's compositions, and he reflected that in his symphonies. He liked the way Wagner pushed music harmonically, and he reflected that to some degree in his symphonies, although it's not as noticeable as some other composers, because his music is very long and tends to move and develop more slowly than others, so you might not notice how intensely chromatic it is at times. He wrote 9 symphonies, although after his death they found 2 that he had not published, early symphonies, which they then gave the numbers 0 and 00. But Bruckner's symphonies, especially his 4th Symphony and his 7th Symphony, are his best-loved symphonies. Oh, and I think I talked about the Curse of the 9 Symphonies in class. If I didn't, remind me and I'll talk about it in class some other day. But Bruckner is another composer who fell victim to the curse of the 9 symphonies. I mentioned his choral music. His best-loved choral music are his motets, which are in Latin. set in Latin Catholic text. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful unaccompanied choral music, which was less common at that time. Talked about Hugo Wolf. I mentioned already, I've actually already kind of alluded to a lot of these last slides, so I'll kind of go through them pretty quickly. Wolf composed 250 songs during a relatively short period of his life. He was, as I said, he was bipolar and manic depressive, so he would shift back and forth between doing absolutely nothing and then composing feverishly. His music really attempts to heighten the text through the use of chromaticism. He was very influenced by Wagner. We're going to talk about Strauss two different times. Strauss, right now, we're going to talk about him as a Romantic composer, composing his tone poems. When we get into the 20th century, he's the first composer we're going to talk about, specifically about his operas. So, Strauss, hugely famous, the most dominant figure in German musical life after Wagner's death. He was a conductor as well, conducted all over the world, conducted the world's best orchestras, actually had a cassette tape of all things of Strauss conducting his own music. It was from the 1940s, because you see, Strauss lived until 1949. He lived a very long life. But now we're talking about composers who lived well into the 20th century. And I'll get to that momentarily. So, as a young man, he wrote primarily tone poems, wrote a lot of them. They're very famous. They're performed all of the time. And then, after 1900, he dedicated himself to operas. He also wrote songs, including some songs that weren't with piano, but they were actually with orchestra accompaniment. Boy, could Strauss use the orchestra. He really knew how to write for it, to utilize all these different timbres and all these different technical abilities. His tone poems take inspiration from Liszt's use of thematic transformation, where he will use a theme and then it will reappear later. What did Strauss write his tone poems about? Because remember, they're program music, so they have to be about something. They're about all sorts of stuff. The first tone poem he wrote was called Don Juan. The character Don Juan, who is the same character as in Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, legendary lover, seducer of women, and also sword fighter. It is fast, it is feverish. One of my teachers once told me that the violin players have more notes in Don Juan than the trombone player will have the entire year in the orchestra. Might have been hyperbole, but I'm not sure. Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, another very, very popular tone poem. It's a musical telling of the old German folk tale of Till Eulenspiegel, who was a prankster, a trickster who went around town playing jokes on everybody. Symphonia Domestica, which was about his home life. Ein Heldenleben, a hero's life, which Strauss wrote about himself, which tells you everything you need to know about Strauss's ego. But probably his most famous tone poem is Also Sprach Zarathustra. So, Thus Spake Zoroaster. It's based on a poem by the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is probably best remembered for probably about his idea of the Superman, which is basically if someone is truly superior to their fellow men, that they are not constrained by the morality of their fellow men. People like Hitler were very fond of, things like this. So, it's a really famous piece of music, specifically the opening, because the opening 2 minutes of this were used in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, and you've all heard the opening 2 minutes of Also Sprach Zarathustra. The whole tone poem itself lasts around half an hour long, and it goes through a lot of different forms, a lot of different moods as it goes through the entirety of Nietzsche's poem. It's a really cool piece. I'm going to put a link to it up on Blackboard. You will, of course, recognize the first 2 minutes, but I recommend that you listen to the whole thing, and I'll see if I can get a score up there as well. And you can really see the way he develops his themes and the way he uses his orchestration. So that is pretty much the end of the Romantic era from an orchestral perspective. Once we got into the 20th century, composers like Strauss and Mahler, and we'll talk about Mahler in the 20th century, because Strauss and Mahler are both late Romantic composers who can be considered to be the first of the great 20th century composers as well. Certainly the first of the great German, Austrian 20th century composers. And so we will pick that up in a later chapter. So there are the homework assignments due. This will all be up on Blackboard, and then we will continue moving through the chapter. I'm sorry, through the book.